You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Now, what we're going to do is we're going to visit or revisit the National Origins Act of 1924. Now, why is this act so controversial? Again, have you noticed that I've been talking about Native American, the red beans, European, the white beans, African American, the black beans, Asian American, the yellow beans, and then now Mexican, the brown beans. And I've been ending with 1924 and this National Origins Act. And one of the reasons why this is the most controversial act concerning immigration, because it passed both houses of Congress, and it took a long time to come together, this act. It started in 1907, and finally by 1924, the act comes to fruition. But basically, both houses of Congress are reacting to the turbulent white migration of populations to the United States. And so you have to remember, students, that when I talked about aliens, the term aliens, it referred to Europeans at first. Then it's going to be applied to Asians and Mexicans. But the National Origins Act of 1924 was influenced into law by the radicalism of white workers who wanted justice. And that's why the Bisbee deportation, the industrial workers of the world, these white workers, they weren't tolerated. They wanted justice for Mexicans too. That's not right. The United States won't tolerate workers like that. When the 1920s began, the US government made sure that the industrial workers of the world was destroyed, that all radical immigrants were deported, and that the main leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, was in jail. So in the 1920s, in fact, during and after World War I, strikes by workers are beaten down by force. Congress in the 20s is going to put an end to the dangerous and turbulent flood of immigrants by passing laws setting immigration quotas. Now, the quotas favored Anglo-Saxons. It kept out Africans, it kept out Asians, it limited the arrival of Southern and Eastern Europeans, and it limited the arrival of people from Czechoslovakia or Slavic peoples, the Slavs. It limited the arrival of Jews. English, Protestant, Irish, and German were favored over African, Chinese, and Eastern and Southern Europeans. Now, the National Origins Act is important because it solidified the melting pot theory for white Americans. And please understand, the melting pot is for white Americans. It ensured the three-generational process of change, or known as assimilation, as defined in earlier presentations, that this assimilation became a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. Yes, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. That's what the National Origins Act of 1924 is all about. WASPs only apply. Now, at the same time, the KKK is going to be revived in the 1920s, and it's spread into the North. By 1924, the KKK is going to boast 4.5 million members. So the warning sign to immigrants coming to America became cemented in the decade that was known as the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. WASPs only apply. Only WASPs apply. Now, you have to understand that the Jazz Age, that the African tradition is going to be imprinted in the Jazz Age, because white Americans are going to try to finally wake up and realize, hey, they really like jazz. And so they'll expropriate that music from the black community and make it theirs. But guess what? The National Origins Act did not include Mexicans. Isn't that great? It did not include Mexicans. Well, why? Because there were significant and powerful industrial and agricultural lobbyists who made sure that Mexicans could enter any time. The compromise was in this bill was that that Mexicans would have to pay a head tax to enter, thereby financing the creation of what will become known as the Border Patrol. Mexicans were wanted. Mexicans were recruited to build the infrastructure of the Southwest. There was transportation, there was mining, there was agriculture, irrigation projects. All of these needed Mexican labor forces. So the United States corporations had optimized their power in Congress in the 1920s. And labor forces are tied to U.S. interests. And so it necessitates movements of populations to the development of the U.S. economy in specific areas. In this place, it's U.S. Southwest and the Midwest. Railroads, agriculture, mining, irrigation projects assured and perpetuated the need for Mexican labor. So students, you are reading a particular chapter by Zaragoza Vargas that helps us understand the need for labor in this era. So let's go to a film clip from Latino Americans and let's appreciate this need for work or workers.
El Paso was the Ellis Island for Mexicans. If you were a strapping young man and you were coming across that Stanton Street Bridge, there would be recruiters from Pennsylvania, from Idaho, from Utah, from Colorado, from California, all over, wanting your labor, bidding for your labor.
It's not just the Mexican Revolution forcing people out. The exodus, if you will, is propelled by the revolution, but it began before that. It has to do with the great labor demand for the booming agricultural economy of the Southwest. This is when the great aqueducts in California are built. This is when the Central Valley towns in California are founded. Same thing is happening in Texas. You have these desert lands being reclaimed and being farmed.
So there was this sort of impetus that there were jobs. But if you're a woman, it's going to be harder for you to get across that border because it was like, well, you know, who's going to support you? Are you liable to become a public charge?
All right, so again, that film clip emphasizes the fact that labor forces are tied to U.S. interests, which necessitates movements of populations for the development, in this particular case of the United States Southwest, and as I shared with you students, you'll be reading a chapter on the U.S. Midwest, where Mexicanos are going to find themselves going into places like Ypsilanti, Michigan, into Chicago. Mexicans are going to be all over in the developing, again, the economic infrastructure of the U.S. marketing system. So throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Mexicanos, as they come into the United States, are going to move into areas that are predominantly Mexican. They're going to move into areas that are, into regions that are environmentally, geographically, and topographically similar to Mexico. And as they entered, Mexicanos are all going to experience the economic discrimination through a dual wage system, through a dual wage structure. And of course, as their numbers grew, the treatment by the dominant society became heightened and alarmist. And so, of course, hysteria surrounds American communities when numbers of perceived foreigners increase. And the mass media can stir up public opinion, which can influence legislation. So throughout the 1920s, debates are going to occur over what to do with, quote unquote, the Mexican problem. Now, the National Origins Act of 1924 did not include the Mexican in the legislation. Mexican, because of corporate interest, all they had to do now was pay a head tax. So since the 1850s, and increasingly around the turn of the 20th century, urban barrios became important centers of economic activity, of political activity, and cultural activity. And so it becomes important for us to appreciate the creation or the development or an understanding of the Mexican barrio. What's important, as American cities were built around Mexican communities, barrios came into being from San Antonio, Texas, all the way through here in Los Angeles, California, through Denver, Albuquerque, Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, San Jose, all the way up to San Francisco. San Diego, all the way up to San Francisco. And so what happened is, as American cities are going to be built around the Mexican communities, a social, psychological, and organizational cohesiveness occurred. Mexican immigrants naturally are going to move into the barrios. Mexican immigrants are going to create their own barrios. An example is Watts and Compton. They were Mexican railroad camps. So when you go into Watts and Compton, the origins of Watts and Compton are when the Mexicans had built the railroads connecting to Los Angeles, they were just dumped, and that became their area to survive. During World War I, when we take a look at the great migration of Southern blacks, of the black experience, as the Southern migration occurs, those moving west are going to enter Watson Compton and be living with the Mexican railroad workers. So as railroads, agriculture, and mining interests, along with massive state-sponsored irrigation projects, they assured and perpetuated the need for Mexican labor. Many Mexicans found themselves moving to states like Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, and Michigan, where they created their own enclaves. So this urban barrio context will be dramatized in the 1920s and 1930s as sociologists became concerned with, quote unquote, the Mexican problem. Let's go to a film clip and appreciate Los Angeles.
1920s Los Angeles was a boom town. Pulled by plentiful work in agriculture, factories, and construction, Mexican immigrants headed to the city in ever-increasing numbers.
In 1900, you had about 3,000 to 5,000 Mexican-American residents. By 1930, you had about 150,000. It's a lot of people.
In the 1800s, Mexicans had built Los Angeles from a mission into the capital of Spanish California. In the 1920s, they would help build it again.
The story of how Mexicans built the city from a rural town to an industrial metropolis is still largely untold. Without the Mexican labor, much of our infrastructure in the city would not exist.
Now immigrants in a land that had once been theirs, Mexicans were viewed as second-class citizens.
A Mexican presents a new problem. He's not black and he's not white. How do we fit this new race into the American system of stratification? That is resolved by just simply extending the practices of segregation that had been developed for African Americans to Mexican Americans.
There were segregated schools. There could be segregated public facilities. For example, the day before they drained the pool, they had International Day, where anyone who wasn't white could go and use the pool.
Most immigrants gravitated toward downtown and settled around La Plaza de Nuestra Reina de Los Angeles. Founded in 1781, the plaza had once been the center of Mexican life in Southern California.
The plaza was a safe place, it was a romantic place, and it was also a memory of their culture.
For the immigrant generation that comes, the sense that the land was once held by a Spanish elite, a Mexican elite, is incredibly important in making people feel that there is a history here that belongs to them.
Both my parents had a sense of history and remembered the place names of Los Angeles. They always told me that you know, that is Sepulveda, that street, that's Pico. My father even pointed out the 3-story Pico house, which at the time was the most elegant, fancy hotel. And my father whispered in my ear and told me, "Mijo, he was one of us. Pio Pico was one of us."
In the 1920s, fueled by a growing Mexican population, Mexican culture was experiencing a revival.
There's a growth of arts. There's the beginnings of the first ever real Mexican-American music culture. It's recording the music of the Mexican Revolution in Los Angeles. It's exporting it down to Mexico. It's a cultural renaissance in a way that one wouldn't see again until the 1960s.
We see restaurants, bakeries, pharmacies, live theaters. Not to forget the Hollywood movie industry as well. I mean, we can have people like a young Ramon Navarro, who starred in the first silent Ben-Hur, was a Mexican immigrant working as a laborer in downtown Los Angeles.
In the era of the silent film, Mexicans became icons of popular culture. A working-class girl, Lupe Velez, and the aristocratic Dolores del Rio offered two contrasting images for Mexican women coming of age.
Dolores del Rio was discovered in an afternoon tea in Mexico City. She was a wealthy, young newlywed. She does not speak English. If you look at her early stills, she looks like a very beautiful but stereotypical Latin American beauty. The hair's done up behind. She's in this rebozo, and she's got this sort of submissive look. Within a few years, when she's an established celebrity, she really sheds the, quote, ethnic imagery. She was able to craft this symbol of the woman on the pedestal, a high-born, sort of Castilian beauty.
I think her beauty is incredibly important for a lot of young Mexican women. She's the inspiration to bring cosmetics into the household. She creates an alternative identity, a new 1920s woman in a Mexican style.
They're bobbing their hair, they're wearing short dresses or they're wearing bloomers, ditching their chaperone and going to the dance hall, the movies.
They're saying, no, wait a second, we're not part of the past of Los Angeles. We're actually part of the future. We're not simply relics from a different era.
Young Mexicans began to build families and moved east, across the Los Angeles River, to Brooklyn Heights, Belvedere, and Boyle Heights, a diverse community in the mountains of East LA. It was there that Natividad Castañeda, a stonemason who had emigrated from Mexico in 1915, settled with his wife Gregoria and their two children, Francisco and his younger sister Emilia, born in Los Angeles in 1926.
It was a happy life that I had when I was a little girl. I used to like to go to school. We used to have some time to play before school started, before we went to do our Pledge of Allegiance. We went to the movies here and there. It used to be a nickel to go to the movies. We used to have a Victrola. I remember one of the records that they used to play. It was a song about Soy virgencita, entre las flores me encontrarás. We had a nice summer porch. We had an avocado in the back. My mother used to love avocados. Maybe my dad planted the avocado for her.
Okay, so let's appreciate something that, students, what we can understand with regards to, again, the urban barrios. Urban barrios became important centers of economic, political, and cultural activity. And as American cities are going to be built around the Mexican communities, a social and psychological and organizational cohesiveness is going to occur. And so Mexican immigrants are naturally going to move into the barrios and create their own barrios.